It's a pleasure to see you again. I got to see you, I think it was up in Keto Fest last summer, I believe, is where I got to meet you. And we talked about some biltong. And and since that time, I've gotten to get a little bit familiar with some of your work. And you've been obviously doing this for a little while, you know, and been involved in research and nutrition and have got a lot of wisdom to speak about. And so I really want to give you kind of an opportunity to talk about whatever you'd like to, but before you do that, for those that are unaware of your contribution to society as a whole in nutrition, can you give us a little bit of background information on who you are?
I'm trained as a enzyme and protein chemist, and I got into nutrition because from teaching metabolism. And I always describe it that medical students think metabolism is like the way somebody described the study of history. It's just one damn thing after another. And so, you know, to provide some consistent theme in my lectures, I tried to focus on low-carb diets. Although our students did go on low-carb diets based on what I said, I was not particularly encouraging that. I was just using it as a scientific method. And at some point, though, I got interested in a professional way, and I was interested in thermodynamics, and people always say, you know, a calorie is a calorie, and the laws of thermodynamics, and I knew they didn't know what they were talking about, so that's how I got into it. It's drifted partly that I've become a critic of the medical literature. That was not really my intention, but I was surprised, you know, in getting into the medical nutrition was a big surprise to me, because I, even though I studied metabolism and did work in coagulation, which is related to heart disease, I didn't really know about cardiovascular disease or lipids, and I had to go back and learn it for myself, and it was kind of a shock. There's a lot of misleading science there. So my current research now is in cancer. I'm working with Eugene Fine from Einstein, Albert Einstein School of Medicine, and most recently we just published, or about to publish, a paper on the synergy between a ketogenic diet in mice and their response to rapamycin. So this is a breed of mice who spontaneously get tumors and lung tumors, and they respond to rapamycin, which is a known inhibitor, and they also respond to a ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet have longer lifetime, as do those with the ketogenic diet. And the combination is synergistic. The idea here is that, well, rapamycin in particular is not really a cancer drug in the sense that it's too toxic and has too many side effects. And that's generally true. A lot of the cancer pharmacology are very difficult drugs in terms of side effects. So we're hoping that if that could be coupled with a ketogenic diet, lower doses would be required, and you'd avoid side effects and the toxic effects. So that's my story.
Well, there's a whole lot there, and I want to touch on some of those aspects. I definitely want to come back to the cancer, but I mean, when you say that the cancer drug has side effects, that must be saying a lot, because most cancer drugs that I'm aware of have pretty good side effects to start with. I mean, it's not unusual for cancer drugs to cause a lot of
I think
issues.
we're interested in the general question. I mean, I mean, Gene is in the clinical, and you know, I'm you know, like I say, a biochemist by training, but I think that most of the chemotherapy is very tough on the patient. Not terrible, actually.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that would share that opinion. Let me go back to one of the first things you said. You said when you looked at it, you know, and you looked at the thermodynamics and people saying, you know, calories a calorie and that's all there is. And there's a lot of people out there that says it doesn't matter what you eat, as long as you're calorie, you're in a net, you know, net deficit you're going to lose. You're in a net surplus you're going to gain. What, I mean, are calories relevant at all? And if they are, or if they are not, is that the only thing that matters? What is your, I mean, just from the broad picture, how would you describe metabolism when it comes to calories? And the competing hypothesis obviously would be a hormonal or food macronutrient component. Given your vast years of experience, what would you say the best way to characterize that sort of situation?
Well, calories are important. If you go on a diet, you're trying to provide energy and cell material. The energy balance is of importance, but the idea that the laws of thermodynamics somehow suggest that there should be energy balance comes, I don't know where it comes from. It's not part of, it's not from the physics. I mean, sometimes a calorie is a calorie. We all have the experience, you know, you know that you notice you don't eat the same thing each day. You're busy, you're running, and your weight never changes. You know, it doesn't. And so frequently a calorie is a calorie. On the other hand, I quote my brother who said, I went on this cruise and they had all this, I really pigged out on all this lobster and roast beef, and I didn't gain a pound. Nobody says that after the pancake breakfast. So you know that it's not just the calories. And, you know, I mean, I think this is one of the general ideas that I feel about nutrition, is that we give up on common sense. I mean, all of us do 3, as many as 5 nutritional experiments every day. It's not, and actually many of us who have a problem are just not attending to the experiment. You know, they're going with somebody's theory. So the major fallacy in people invoking the thermodynamics is that, well, fundamentally, they don't know anything about thermodynamics. What they mean when they say that variable efficiency in a diet violates thermodynamics, they mean the first law. But the first law is a conservation law. It says that energy is conserved. But that's not really what thermodynamics is about. Thermodynamics is about the second law. And the second law says that any real process is inherently inefficient. It means that not just that you can't finely machine all the parts of your device to cut down friction. It means that inherently, theoretically, you're tied to inefficiency. And how that applies to diet is that it's very unlikely that any 2 diets of different composition have exactly the same efficiency. Now, of course, if you're on a weight loss diet, you're striving for inefficiency. You don't want to be good at storing fat. But So the idea wasn't real to begin with. In fact, I'm hesitating because the first law of thermodynamics actually contains the germ of the second law. And so people, if you ask somebody, what does the first law say? It says energy is conserved. But it's more subtle than that. And if you take a real course in thermodynamics, what you learn is that the first law says there's a thing called the energy, and in any process, the change in that energy is equal to the heat added to the system minus the work that's done by the system. And so that tells you a little bit about the history of thermodynamics. It comes from the Industrial Revolution. It was a big deal to make an efficient steam engine. But if you look at the technical aspects, if you're really studying this in graduate school, what you learn is that the energy is what's called a state variable. And what that means is it is independent of path. That means it's independent of what diet you're on, or the energy will change. The energy will not change. The heat and the work, however, are not state variables. They will change. It's only the sum that is conserved. So if you identify work, most of the work that living organisms do is chemical work, and there's no reason why it is conserved at all between two experiments. I don't know if that's too much of an answer, but...
Yeah, that gets quite a bit into physics, which is interesting. Hey, I want to transition, because you said you dabbled in or thought about low-carb diets, and I think there's some interesting thoughts about that with regards to weight loss, but I think in particular when we see this sort of debate around insulin resistance, what's causing insulin resistance, how do you fix insulin resistance, and then by sort of extrapolation, diabetes in general. I've seen a lot of literature, and I'm sure you're aware of it, where we see people that improve quote-unquote metabolic markers of diabetes or insulin resistance on low-carb diets relative to, say, low-fat diets. Maybe we see better glycemic control, maybe a few other things get better. Is there anything to that? And, I think there's a lot of maybe attempting to shift the goalposts now, because we're seeing so many people get good glycemic numbers on low-carb diets, and now they're saying it's not about what your day-to-day glucose is, it's how well you tolerate an oral glucose tolerance test. You should be able to tolerate a lot of carbohydrates. So what are your thoughts around low-carb diets when they come to the treatment of diabetes, insulin resistance versus other caloric reduction, low-fat diets, so on and so forth?
I'd like to plug my book here. It's called Nutritional Crisis, but it has 3 rules for what to eat. And the first rule is that if you're okay, you're okay. In other words, if you don't have a health problem, if you're getting some exercise and you're not overweight, you're probably eating the right thing. You may want to find out if there's another angle on nutrition, but basically, there is this idea that there was a Garden of Eden diet that we were all on until some guy brought high fructose corn syrup into the world. I don't think that's real. There are different diets, and we don't. People do okay on them. The second rule has 2 parts, and that is if you want to lose weight, don't eat. I said this as a joke at a conference, but there's something to it, and it certainly plays out in. That's a part of thermodynamics that's true. If you don't eat anything, you'll lose weight. But obviously, starvation is not the way to go. If you have to eat, don't eat carbs. So that's there are a million ways to lose weight. Carbohydrate restriction is clearly the most efficient and the easiest for most people. And the third rule is if you have diabetes or metabolic syndrome, you have to try a low-carb diet first. At this point, well, I was the first author on a review in 2015 on low-carb diets as the first approach to treating diabetes. And it had 26 authors. Peer review is nothing compared to getting agreement with 25 other guys. But it laid out all the principles of, we had the 12 points of evidence as to why a low-carb diet is what you should do first. I mean, you know, there's no miracle anyplace. It may not work for everybody, but the science says that's what you should do first. And since then, all the experiments support this, and now work from Virta Health, Sarah Hallberg and Jeff Volek, they've nailed this. Anybody that says there's a better first choice has to address her data. You know, she had hundreds of people. They all got better. They came off drugs. So yeah, it's an absolute as to what you should do first.
Yeah, I want to dig a little deeper in that, and I love what you say. If you're doing good, you're doing good, and I kind of echo some of that stuff. I'm saying, you know, look, you know, there's, you know, you don't fix something that ain't broke. Sometimes is a pretty good heuristic to go by. But let me, I don't know, I assume you're familiar with some of the work from the early 1900s, you know, 1920s. I'm looking at an author, particularly a guy named Louis Newberg and Marsh. I guess you can want to Harry Newberg, but he was at the University of Michigan, and he was competing with Jocelyn back in the day, right before insulin dropped in. You know, we had all these horrible type 1 diabetics that were dying of inanition and starving to death and falling apart. And, you know, some of the people were treating the diabetics with fasting just to try to get their sugar down. He was having actually more success with what he called desugarization, which I love that word, by doing basically with a lower calorie but a very high fat approach. And he was restricting protein, and he was getting excellent results. He wasn't seeing DKA, so these people were probably, you know, at the time they weren't able to, I guess, check for beta hydroxybutyrate. I think they could only assess for, you know, they had something that react with ferric chloride, I believe was the reagent they used, but he was taking these diabetics that were on their deathbed. You know, they were infected. They had, you know, blood sugars of 500-600, and within a week, I mean, he was bringing them down to normal numbers. And he was saying that he had people that failed fasting, and I'm wondering why that is. And I'm also wondering about your thoughts on protein, glucose, or sugar, I mean carbohydrates and fat, in relation to gluconeogenic potential. His numbers, he said that, you know, 100 grams of protein could yield 58 grams of glucose, you know, and obviously glucose is 100, you know, carbohydrates 100. Are his numbers, or the numbers that they were done in that day, do they hold up now? I know that's theoretical based on the gluconeogenic amino acids, but I've seen isotope data where it doesn't seem to show that. Is a diabetic different? What are your thoughts on that, or do you have any?
No, that's not right. Well, Jocelyn also was a proponent of low-carb diets, and I have some of his early books, and you can get them on Google. They're interesting. And the only thing is that with Jocelyn is that when insulin was discovered, I mean, it was obviously a miracle for these guys. Even the people treating patients with low-carb diets, there was always problems. And it was a miracle. The trouble is they misinterpreted that as evidence that diabetes was a hormone deficiency disease, which, while it is explicitly, it's more of a system disease. It controls everything. And so Jocelyn then said people could go on a, quote, normal diet, although I don't know whether carbohydrates are really normal for everybody. I mean, high carbohydrate. The idea about protein and gluconeogenesis, that's not right. First of all, it's very variable. And, but I think I think that's wrong. I mean, unfortunately, I don't know the details. I had discussed this with Dr. Bernstein, and Nuttall and Gannon have done some interesting studies on protein, and the predictions are not easy to make. So different proteins give you a different effect on blood glucose, but in general, what would be considered a high protein diet there's nothing wrong with that. As a general rule, it is a clinical problem, and so I don't want to give too detailed. I mean, I would say one of the problems we have now, which you guys have are taking on, is this. Well, I see it as a last-ditch effort to maintain high carbohydrate. It's red meat, plant-based. All of this stuff is crazy. It's and is very bad science. And well, to some extent, I'm not a proponent of anything. I'm not particularly a proponent of red meat, possibly except for myself. But I'm very strongly opposed to the attack on red meat. So I describe my philosophy as anti-dis carnivorianism, the longest nutritional word in the language. I don't know if I got off track there, but I think the role of protein in diabetes is an expert's area, a clinical expert's area, and I don't think you can make too many simple deductions.
Yeah, I'll just share observations with this community that we see is that we see a lot of people do better when they dial down the protein a little bit, and then they may be able to dial it back up as they become more, I guess, metabolically healthy, if that's a word. I love the anti-dis carnivorism sentiment. I think that's a great word. Let me ask you a little bit about, well, a lot, because this is where your current area of interest is about cancer. And you're talking about rapamycin, which obviously impacts mTOR. We hear a lot that, from guys like Ron Rosedale and other folks and talking about, hey, we need to really, really dial back mTOR stimulation. Guys like Walter Longo are doing studies out there looking at, mice and nematodes and other lower animals. I don't know that we have great human data that would suggest that yet. But what is your thought? I mean, there is a differential expression of mTOR, with regard to protein. Some people say, well, you got to avoid protein because you're going to stimulate mTOR and that's going to give you cancer. But at the same time, we're seeing that mTOR is stimulated differentially in muscle when you're exercising. And in that situation, protein might be more helpful. If we give rapamycin to animals or even humans, or it's particularly animals, they become sarcopenic typically because it's a broad spectrum. It doesn't, it's like the COX-2 inhibitors versus the general cyclooxygenase inhibitors. Rapamycin just shuts down everything from my understanding. So we end up with a lack of muscle protein synthesis. What causes cancer? What role does protein have in it? We see that insulin affects mTOR as well. We see that calories affect mTOR as well. Can you give us an overview of how to sort of process the sentiment that mTOR is awful in all situations, or is it not, or is it more nuanced?
You hit it exactly, by which I mean it's totally confused. We don't know what causes cancer. Well, if you undertake a serious conversation on cancer, the first thing is that people will say is there is no cancer. Even in the same tissue, you can have different cancers. So the bottom line I have on this is that the glass is more than half full. It's really every reason to be optimistic about getting some kind of dietary control over cancer. That's different than saying that we have any big answer. mTOR is important. Insulin for sure is important. Okay. The problem with all of these things is that they don't have single targets. Okay, a lot of things stimulate mTOR, and mTOR stimulates other things. I always wanted to make a cartoon. You probably know the Larson cartoon of what you say to your dog. Listen, Rover, I don't want you to mess around. You messed up the whole house, Rover. Rover, be a good dog. And what the dog hears is Rover, blah, 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 Rover, blah, 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 Rover. Okay. So you see these metabolic charts, and they've got PI3K and mTOR and P10 and P53 and insulin stimulates that. And when I look at these, what I see is insulin, blah, 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 insulin, blah, blah, blah. Even things like PI3K, where we have a good idea of how important it is and what some of its effects are, we're not there yet. We're not there in being able, because it, I was listening to an excellent YouTube by Lou Cantley, and he was saying about, how the effects of insulin and PI3K are consistent across all kinds of cancer. And he had some very interesting statements, the last one of which is a lot of other things stimulate PI3K. For those of your listeners who, this is not particularly technical, what it is simply is that when you stimulate a cell with insulin, there are response agents that follow that, and PI3K is just one of those. And K is for kinase, it phosphorylates itself and other targets. So I don't know. That's not much of an answer, but.
Well, I think you point out the fact that as you go deeper down the rabbit hole, it gets more and more complicated. And then the more you dig, you realize it's going to be a tough nut to crack. And I wonder, you made a comment about, you can look in the same tumor and see, 57 different types of cells. And so the people that have kind of thought, hey, this is a somatic mutation, it's a multiple hit theory, we got these sensitivities and genetic thing, and then we have these environmental things, and boom, now we have this DNA damage, now we have all these somatic mutations. Well, that doesn't bear out with that saying that you've got different cells within the same tumor that don't share, they're not clones, or they have different DNA. And that's just something that guys like Thomas Seyfried point out. And, when and I'm sure you might be aware of his work, but he's saying, look, cancer is a metabolic mitochondrial issue, where the mitochondria have been, there's been issues with that. Any thoughts on his sort of take on some of the possible rationales for why we develop cancers and how we should perhaps treat cancer?
Yeah, well, he has some very important work, and he has some very important ideas. But I think in his general talk, he tends to exaggerate for the reason that we know that the genetic and metabolic effect, you can't separate them. I mean, in the simplest way, if you think of DNA as the blueprint, it's not, the cell is not a factory where they send out the information on the blueprint with the blueprint and the workers carry it out. You keep going back to the blueprint and you keep changing the blueprint. So it's not easy to separate those two things. I think it's important to consider the other direction. In other words, that the metabolic effects can affect DNA itself, and so it's not always easy to know which came first. So I mean, what I would say is that it's not really that we there is the sense that we may have invested too much money in the genome, and we've ignored metabolism, and that it in some people's mind is actually a conspiracy theory, but it's not exactly like that. What it is that we got very good information about the genome. Molecular biology has become tremendously powerful, and it is true we can cure some cancers, small number really, but what it is that it's not nice to fool Mother Nature. It turned out to be much more complicated than we hoped. There are rare cancers where you're going to find well-defined mutations. So, and I don't think people are specifically opposed to the metabolic approach beyond the sense that we're not in the best situation for funding research. And the big labs that are actually getting the information on the genomic approach, it's not sensible to ask them to turn around. And so I think we definitely need more study in metabolic disease, and more support for safe food, and comes to mind even my research. And so I still think that in cancer, it's hard to make generalizations beyond being optimistic. We just don't have it. That's not a great message, but we are making progress. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an uphill battle, and you see where most of the funding, and I can see where the genomic stuff, tailors itself for precision medicine, and that means usually a precision pharmaceutical, precision
What does that mean?
therapeutic.
I'm about to get in a fight with the head of the NIH because he's talking about precision nutrition. I probably will refrain from telling him a story. I saw a guy on, it was a congressional hearing about overcharging the military by industries. And the congressman was holding up a bill for $200 they charged the Army for some small part. And he said the bill says precision shafting, and this is one time the American public got what it paid for. So that's, I'm afraid, my reaction to precision nutrition. But what is precision medicine supposed to be? You look at everybody's genome?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what the promise is, and I think that promise has been, I mean, I look at this stuff as for entertainment purposes only. When these people are all getting their genomes, so that's cute and it's interesting, but what's it really mean? For my definition, precision nutrition is cooking a steak to the right temperature. I mean, that's my definition of precision. But
you overcook a steak, that's a terrible thing.
That is a crime. It is, and I live with someone who likes her steaks well done, and it pains me to have to do that for her. But anyway, I want to, one other thing about cancer and nutrition. I mean, is it fair to say that regardless of whether it's preventative, treatment-wise, or adjuvant, nutrition plays at least some small role in cancer in general? I know you're looking at ketogenic diets and seeing it in mice, and so my assumption would be you seem to feel that way because you're researching it. So what are your thoughts on, does nutrition have a role in either the development or the mitigation of cancer in any way?
Well, yeah, of course, everything you take into your body is going to have an effect, and I think the question you're asking, can we get at this with nutritional methods? And I think it's almost for sure we can make a big difference. The trouble is that what we know right now is a big role for insulin. And you know, I don't know how much else we know. So, I mean, we're following the idea. I mean, one of the, that's one of the players that you know is a big player. There are obviously different fat species that are critical, but we're following the line that the strongest correlation you find is in between the effects of the mechanisms of diabetes and cancer. And the common denominator there, again, is insulin.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at the associational data, and the caveat is it's associational data, so you can't apply causation, but there does seem to be a pretty significant link between hyperinsulinemia, diabetes, and development of many cancers. So I think it's fair to say there's at least some relationship. What that is for sure is probably, as you say, probably we still have to figure that out. I want to transition, about in the beginning you said something about as you looked into the medical literature and particularly some of the medical nutritional literature, you were a little bit maybe concerned about the quality or the standard.
No, I was really pissed off.
What do you mean by that?
No, it's corruption of science. It's very, we have a very serious problem there. It is partly it is that so much of the literature is full of these observational studies, and it is not true that association never implies causality. It does imply causality, and there are standards for when it does and when it doesn't. And I think most people now are more familiar with Bradford Hill's criteria. Bradford Hill did the work on the association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. And he had a number of criteria. And this is in a presidential address from the 60s, which I recommend to everybody because it's a very clear statement of how to do science and how to deal with observational studies. And he was very clear. It's not cut and dried rules. It's common sense and, scientific information. So his first rule is that the association should be a strong association, and that the odds of ratio, he thought if you got as low as 2 to 1, that was questionable. And for perspective, if you try to introduce epidemiology as evidence in a court of law, if you don't have 2 to 1, you better have something else that's pretty good. And it's well known that what he found is that the association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer was 20 to 1. And if you if you're a big heavy smoker, that was 30 to 1. Now you look at the medical literature on nutrition, they never hit 2 to 1. They're lucky if they hit 1.5. And how do you evaluate that? Well, you evaluate it in common sense. Well, people like different forms of this. I like odds ratio. So a hazard ratio, the terms hazard ratio, risk ratio, in the kinds of studies they do, those are all the same. So you can take them all as about equal. If you have 1.5, a quick way to figure out what the odds are is you need a calculator, but you just add 1, make it 2.5, and then you take the reciprocal. You take 1 over 2.5, which of course is 4, and multiply by 10. That's the lower end, 40-60. So 1.5 is 40-60 ratio. Well, how much are you going to change your lifestyle over 40-60? Especially since, as it's usually done, it's not a question of getting better versus getting sick. What it usually is you're comparing, say, a low-carb diet with a high-carb diet. 40-60 is the difference in the risk. In other words, if you don't get sick on the low-carb diet, you are going to get sick on the high-carb diet. They're looking at the people who are sick. So you're not getting away. I usually have a slide that has a roulette wheel. You don't get your chips back. And so these are, all of these studies are not telling you anything. So I'm trying to do this systematically now and call it the limits of nutritional epidemiology. And the likely conclusion will be that the limits are absolute, that it's just not a useful field. I would say that it's not my basic style. I don't like being a critic. Actually, most of my life I thought of myself as a straight arrow. And times have changed, but I used to provide as evidence that of how straight I was, that I've smoked much less marijuana than recent presidents of the United States. So, but things have changed, I guess. So.
There are other critics out there, vocal critics. Professor John Anitis from Stanford, you're probably familiar with his work, and he says, we continue to fund and do these epidemiologic studies in nutrition where we constantly this 1.13 relative risk, 0.97, 1.2, and it's over and over and over again, and they mean nothing. And so why do we keep funding these studies? What is the rationale behind it? Because it never shows us anything, and we keep testing the same data for the same hypothesis, and it's been a big fat zero as far as I'm concerned. Why do you think we continue to fund those studies?
That's not my field. But it's not anybody's field. I always quote Shakespeare and Macbeth that there's no art to find the mind's construction in the face. There's no way to figure out what people do. They just it's I don't know. It's well, among the other things I've studied is behavioral psychology, and I've become a radical behaviorist. And it really is, if you're in the Harvard School of Public Health, how can you be saying stuff that just, doesn't make sense? And especially when some guy tells you it doesn't make sense. I mean, red meat causes diabetes, okay? Now, one of Bradford Hill's criteria is an experiment. It's interesting to see how far we've come in 50 years or so. That was not the highest priority, but we have data on red meat change and the incidence of diabetes in the population. And diabetes, we all know, has gone up significantly, and red meat consumption has gone down significantly. I mean, these are big numbers, not these small hazard ratios. So that means it's wrong. I wrote to Walter Willett, and I told him that, well, I had this discussion. Walter and I have I actually described our relationship to him because give him credit. He did support a petition for Tim Noakes, and I asked him that based on our collegial relationship, which I described as similar to General Patton and the Russian generals, one son of a bitch to another. So he recognized that as the right thing. But I finally told him very recently. I wrote a message to him. The data say that the association that he describes of red meat and diabetes is wrong. It's not controversial. It's not questionable. It's wrong. So we'll see what he says.
Well, I can tell you within this community, we have people that eat nothing but red meat that have diabetes, and they've seen the best blood sugar control of their life. They come off all their medications. I mean, that's about as a powerful statement as possible, and that's something, as you may be aware, we're funding a research trial, and that's going to be part of one of the outcomes we're going to be looking at. So we're going to have direct, I would say pretty incontrovertible evidence that if you only feed people red meat and their hemoglobin A1C drops 2 to 3 points, it's going to make pretty hard to make an argument that meat causes diabetes. And I agree with your relationship. I mean, we've since 1977, our meat consumption has fallen something like 30 to 40% red meat, particularly beef. And, we went up in chicken and some of those other things, but, and obviously we see our diabetes, obesity, chronic disease rates just going up like crazy. Let me ask you about, you said something about heart disease, etiology of heart disease. We got that wrong too. Can you further extrapolate on that? Is cholesterol the bad deal? Is it nuanced? What's the story on that? Or do you care to weigh in?
No, I'm actually not an expert on that. All of the epidemiology stuff is screwy. I trust David Diamond, but and Ravenscoff. I remember Ravenscoff's first book. I think he's giving away for nothing now on the internet. And I remember reading it, and I thought, geez, it can't be this bad. I got to go back and read these papers originally. It is that bad. I mean, it's just. It's just not real science. So I don't have an answer. I'm not sure we have any answer. I am partial to the notion that it's more closely tied to blood coagulation. But I don't know that for sure. I mean, I haven't been in blood coagulation for 10 years now, so I don't know the actual state of things. So I have to admit ignorance here.
Yeah, that would be a theory espoused by guys like Malcolm Kendrick, who thinks that there is some coagulopathy that's going on, and maybe there's some other people have posed chronic vascular inflammatory issues. Is it related? Clearly we see just like cancer, we see a huge link between insulin resistance, diabetic pathophysiology, and cardiovascular disease. We see it with elevations in people that have autoimmune diseases, vasculitis. So, obviously there's a lot of things going on there. So that's,
I think that the LDL story is, at best, wildly exaggerated. I think it probably has very little importance at all. And my impression is that, and in this I tend to trust actual physicians who, statins may be useful for people who've already had a cardiac event, but in terms of, it's not a miracle drug. And it for sure has side effects.
Yeah, I think maybe the opinion that LDL is a dependent variable, and it depends upon a lot of other things maybe being put forth by some people that, unfortunately, like I allude to Malcolm Kendrick, if you start sticking your head above the parapet, it gets knocked off, and he's been banned from, his Wikipedia entry was just deleted because he was espousing something that didn't go with the LDL hypothesis. And so I think it's a little bit.
So was mine. Mine on low carb diet was deleted, and so was intention to treat, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with that term.
I'm familiar with the term intention to treat. I'm not sure in what regard you were deleted from with.
Well, my argument was that it's a screwy idea. You know, the idea that you, if you randomize a person to a trial and they don't carry out the protocol, you have to include their data anyway. So if you're testing a pill, some drug, and you assign people to take the drug and, you know, some protocol, if you know that they didn't take the drug, you got to drop them out of the trial. Everybody knows that. Intention to treat says you have to include their data. I mean, it's just the dumbest thing. I mean, I know where it comes from. I mean, obviously, if you have a big clinical trial and you tell people what to do and you don't know what they did, you have to include their data. But once you know what they did, they're either in the study or they're not in the study. I mean, I published a paper on this, and I got really strange comments by reviewers. But they did drop my Wikipedia entry, even though I followed their protocol. You know, I said, critics say that. And, you know, I didn't want to fight with anybody that I'm not already fighting with. So.
Well, certainly appreciate your insight in that stuff. And, you know, I've just commented, like I said, you know, one of the criticisms is sometimes, you know, they have some of the drug companies or drugs and they'll exclude people from the study that had to drop out too early from side effects. So we don't even know the side effect profile in some of those. So that's another kind of the opposite problem where we see that as well. Well, I'll tell you what, this has been fascinating. It's been truly educational. We're almost right up at an hour, and so I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I think everybody really enjoyed this. Dr. Feinman, where can people find, you know, I guess not on Wikipedia, but where can people find you if they want to learn more? What books do you have out there? Where do people go to find you, maybe on social media, if you're on social media?
The book is called Nutritional Crisis, and you should buy it now because it's really cheap. The publisher is unloading it. And if you donate to Nutrition and Metabolism for $50, I'll send you one with personalized autograph. So that's the place to look. But, you know, I think you can work back. You know, I would start with Verta Health. And like I say, Sarah Hallberg has really hit it. In some sense, it's not even that it's a breakthrough in the sense that it's been 10 years of people trying to do this, and she just finally got it so that you just can't deny it. On cancer, you know, there's a lot of good work, Dom D'Agostino, and I think the usual players are always a good place to start because, you know, there's now such a community, and so I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but and you know, you want to get a good judge for those what you read, and one of the good judges may be yourself. You know, I mean, what you have to do is what it takes to be a scientist is you have to be very critical. And what it takes to be a professional scientist is you have to be critical of yourself. And my description, I mean, there's no definition of science. It's a human activity like art or music or something. One of my definitions of science is if you don't wake up in the middle of the night, grab your stomach and you think, God, this could all be wrong, then you're not doing science. You know, if you're not going to hold yourself up to the high standards, that's not it. And you want to do that for what you read. So you want to be critical.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I say, the only thing I know with 100% certainty is I got something wrong, and I think that's, you know, that's all I can say. And everything else, you know, you hopefully you kind of gradually get to the answer that's hopefully as right as you can get it. And I think you just have to.
That's what I say about all these epidemiologists. You know, if they did experimental work, if they did lab work, you make so many mistakes, you really can't take yourself that seriously. So they should get into the lab at least for a while. Mix a couple of things.
Yeah, and I think the clinical end is a lab for humans. What we see in clinical practice, and I think we're seeing a lot of things. And I think my thought is there's some. We have a lot of top down when it comes to medical treatment. Big drug company makes a drug, runs a few trials, and then pushes it downward. Whereas we're doing the opposite. We're looking at people and figuring out what works for people by collecting their collective experience. And I think the social media is allowing us to do that. And I think we can apply some real data collection tools to really sort of change the paradigm, particularly when it comes to these lifestyle non-drug measures. But anyway, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. I look forward to shaking your hand in person again one day. Well, hopefully when this craziness of coronavirus is all past us and we're all back to normal life. That'll be great.
I would say that, I know you're out of time, but I would say that one of the things that really set me off, and a lot of people, is to see that the increased risk to people with diabetes from COVID-19. And, we know how to treat that. And it's really a shame to see that.
I've been profoundly disappointed at our nation's, our health authorities, our government's response with regard to not looking after people's metabolic health during this time. It's such a, the effort that they're putting in to put everybody in a mask and lock everybody down. If we would spend 10% of that effort to educate people, we would probably save a hell of a lot more lives, quite honestly. But anyway. Okay, guys, thank you. Got to go. Dr. Feinman, thank you once again. Everybody, we'll see you back tomorrow. Take care, everybody, and have a great day. Bye-bye now.